Okay, yes, we're gonna talk about swatching, but hear me out. Because I think the more interesting and fun and equally important part of swatching is getting to know the fabric. Because you can guess, you can have a decent idea, oh, I think I know how this yarn will behave, but until you actually get it on your needles, you don't really know. So, fingering weight yarn. Usually with finger eight weight yarn, I start at a 4, at a US 4. That's my most commonly used size for this weight. This is a little on the thin side, so I had a feeling I was going to switch to 3s, but I wanted to see what 4s felt like. And it was pretty nice. It's very different than the original fabric, but I like it. It's drapey, but not wholly. And oh, I really like the fabric on 3s. And it's that slight bit neater as well. The 4s are pretty beautiful. I don't hate the 4s, but it's just that little bit too loose. It's kind of amazing. This is, I believe, this one is 6 over an inch. This one is 5.5 over an inch. Or, so we're half a stitch different on these, but the fabric feels different. It's kind of amazing how that happens to me. The neatness, it's hard to say. I think it's probably because I'm sometimes a little bit too quick when I swatch. That is a bad thing I should not do. Sometimes I do. Especially if I feel like, this isn't the needle size, and I'm kind of trying to rush to the end just to make sure, because sometimes I do get it wrong. And here's an example of how I can get it wrong. So on this one, I started on 3mm needles. I went down, I think that's US 2.5 maybe. Because the 3s, the US 3s I liked, but I wanted to see what it would be like even denser. And so I went to 3mm. And it felt rough. And it felt rough, I'm sure, in part because of the fact that I was using needles I don't like. My 3mm needles are carbons, and we're not friends. But it didn't feel, it just felt strange. I didn't love it. There's nothing wrong with it. I could knit a sweater at this gauge, and there'd be nothing wrong with it. But if you've watched this for a while, I feel like there's some gauges that a fabric just sings at. And I'm always kind of searching for those. And so I went down two more needle sizes, because this is US this is 2.5mm. I have no idea what size that is in US. And 2.5mm, the fabric is fabulous. It's definitely less drape, but not, this is still a pretty drapey yarn, considering, right? We're looking at two very different, but very similar fabrics. And so this starts to give me an idea of what the fabric will do and what kind of a sweater, and this is going to be a sweater, especially, if you're making a shawl, this shawl can be your swatch, right? You'll get to know the fabric as you go, because if it's off by a little, nobody cares. And usually within 1 or 2 needle sizes, you can do this. Sometimes I do, but I'm much more likely to just start going. And if I don't like the feel of the fabric, I'll know which direction I need to change, and I'll rip the whole thing back and do that. For a sweater, especially if you're doing a top down, if you're doing a bottom up, once you get past the ribbing, you can have a swatch in a couple of hours. But if you're doing it top down, you're not going to start to get a good feel of the fabric until you're really far in. And then that's a lot that's a lot more work to rip back. So I'll argue for it. I think all of these took me an hour, maybe 2. They're mindless. You don't have to look, you don't have to pay attention, but I understand so much more about this fabric, and that's going to help me choose a design that works best with the fabric that I have. So I do have a design in my head. I want to do a shawl collar V-neck, 3/4 length sleeves. And there's going to be an argument for both. There's going to be an argument for doing it on the 3s, and there's actually an argument for doing it on this, because when you have something this lightweight, a little bit extra structure, a little bit sort of the fabric is firmer. You know how when you have a really sort of clingy t-shirt and it shows everything, whereas if you have something that's just that little bit thicker, it gives you a cleaner silhouette. So there's an argument for doing this on sock needles. I'm not sure I'm happy about that argument, but that's a whole different problem. In this particular case, this is yarn that I thrifted by pulling out a sweater. And here is the back that I have not yet ripped out. This gauge is 7 stitches an inch, which is the same as the gauge I got on 2.5 millimeter needles. Doesn't look the same, but that's machine knitting. But because it was thrifted, and it was a very large cardigan, it came way over my butt. So I said, well, let me see what it is DK. And I started swatching on 6s. And I was, it felt really stiff. So I swatched on 7s. And the funny thing is that I'm now going to rip this back after I film this and do a whole swatch on 6s, because I think this might actually be the fabric I love. It's got a similar feel, hand feel, to the 3s, just thicker, which is strange because you'd think this is pretty dense, right, for DK weight. Well, it's always different when you hold 2 strands together instead of something that's actually spun, but I think I might like this better. This I still do like. It's nice, but there's something cashmere-y about the softness on 6s. It's not cashmere. It's 80% wool, 20% nylon. It's a sock yarn sweater, and so I'm leaning towards this. And I never would have found any of that out if I hadn't taken the time to swatch. Now, normally, you wouldn't buy a sweater's quantity of yarn and then knit it. That's unusual. You probably would not choose to do that unless you just didn't like the yarn at this gauge. There's an argument for this, though. Because then I don't know, does feeling things give you ideas? That sounds crazy. But I think feeling the fabric, seeing how it is in your hand, gives me a really good idea of what that garment would be like on my body. And I'm thinking, if I actually did this, even though I really like this fabric is warmer than this fabric. So if I want something 3/4 length sleeves, that's really more of a transitional piece under a jacket in fall, then this would be the fabric to go for. Or maybe this. Which was the 3s? This way. That's bind off. Yeah, bind off is the 3s. And that's why I do this. I've gotten distracted. I am in fact sitting here going through in my head what the sweater like this, how it would move. Because it's in my hand, I know how that garment would move. And I know how this one would. And I can decide between those, what am I going for? Do I want something swingy and drapey? In this case, no, I don't think I do. I want something a little more structured. And once I decide, if the swatch isn't big enough, so if I go for this, the swatch isn't big enough. I'm not getting good numbers off that. And since I'm very likely to be knitting this top down, I would do a real proper gauge swatch and get my numbers off that. Because those numbers are how I know, because I already know that there's no pattern I want in any of the gauges I was looking at. So I know I'm going to be riffing, which means I'm going to need good numbers. I want to make sure it fits. And it's going to be on the more tailored side. Not negative ease, not 0 ease, but maybe only 2 inches of ease. And I definitely want something like a set-in shoulder. Maybe a raglan. We'll see. But you have less room to fudge, right? And the less room you have to fudge, the more time you want to spend on your numbers before you start. So that's my theory on gauge swatching and why I go a little bit mad, but I think it helps with my end product. I think that's why when I get a sweater off my needles, there's no such thing as I don't love this sweater. That's never happened. Worth a try, don't you think? Anyway, thanks for watching. See you later.